All right, welcome everyone to our River Detectives Ask the Expert webinar. The topic this time round is environmental water. So I'm Britt Gregory and I coordinate the statewide River Detectives program. So I work with your teachers right across the state of Victoria to deliver this program in your classrooms. And we've got a very special guest expert with us today, Genevieve Smith from the North Central Catchment Management Authority. And Genevieve is an environmental water manager who coordinates the delivery of environmental water to wetlands and rivers right across the North Central catchment. But it's worth knowing that there's other environmental managers in your catchment right across the state who do a very similar thing to Jen. So welcome, Jen. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Britt. Thanks for having me.
No problem. So first of all, I'd just like to do an acknowledgement of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people right across Victoria, their continued rich culture and spiritual connection to country and to our waterways. And we also recognise and acknowledge the contribution and interest of First Nations people and organisations in land, water, climate and biodiversity management. So Jen and I live and work on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and I hope that you know who the traditional owners are of the land where you live and where you go to school. And just take a moment to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of your lands. Thanks, Jen. So very excited to have you here with us today. Unfortunately, due to the coronavirus and remote learning that everybody's doing at the moment, we're actually pre-recording this session. So usually we'd like to do a session like this live with you in the classroom, and you'd all have an opportunity to ask Jen questions throughout the session, but yeah, we just decided that this time it was going to be a little bit easier to pre-record the session, but we have had a few questions submitted before today, so I'll be asking those on behalf of the students throughout our presentation. So today Jen is going to take us through a bit of an explanation of what e-water is, what environmental water is, sometimes called e-water. Why we need it, why the filling and drying is important, the different types of e-flows to rivers and wetlands and how they differ, and how e-water can improve water quality, vegetation, habitat, things like that. So Jen's the expert. I'll let her explain it all. Yes, so Jen, would you like to take it away and bring up your presentation and guide us through what you'd like to help us to understand today?
All right, well, yeah, thank you again for having me today. So hopefully you'll all learn something about environmental water. We also call it water for the environment. And Britt's just done the acknowledgement of country, so thank you for doing that, Britt. So straight into what is environmental water? Environmental water, quite simply, it's water that's managed to improve or maintain the health of rivers and wetlands, and especially that's aimed at the plants and animals that rely on those water floodplains and rivers for survival. It's also specifically, it's a type of what we call entitlement for the environment. So it basically means the environment has its own rights to water. And in terms of environmental water and how it's managed by a range of government agencies across Victoria, including the catchment management authorities where I work, and also the environmental water holders. So why do we need environmental water? Well, I think the key to answering this question is that we need to consider how Australian systems have changed over the last 150 years. And that's mainly due to human activities as well as climate change more recently. This image that you can see on the screen represents the river systems as they would have been before development, as we call it. So that means before the construction of dams and weirs and channels. And if you have a look at that image, you can see lots of beautiful river systems that are connected to floodplains and wetlands, and there's lots of watery habitat around for fish and turtles and frogs, as well as water birds and other water-dependent animals. And there's also lots of trees and plants and animals that rely on those kind of habitats to survive.
I can even see a little platypus in that image. Beautiful.
So fast forward to the present day in this image, and you can see that things have changed a bit in the river system. Up the top of the rivers, near the mountains, you can see some dams that have been put in place, and you can see pipelines coming off those dams that supply water to houses. And further down, you can see where weirs have been built and channels that take water out of the system for agriculture, for crops and livestock, as well as to put into farm dams as well. And you can see some livestock drinking at those farm dams as well. So I guess what this means is that especially the dams and weirs, they represent barriers to fish movement, and they also mean that much less water is getting down to the ends of the river, down to that large waterway at the bottom of the screen.
So, Jen, when you say barriers to fish movement, I can see an example of a weir there in that picture. So that acts as a bit of a wall, is that right? So the fish can't get up, they can't climb the wall basically, can they,
Yeah,
to get further upstream?
that's right. In southern Australia, we don't have any climbing fish just yet. So yeah, basically that's what it is. It's a wall, and the fish below that will hit their heads on it. And the fish above can sometimes go over the top, but they won't be able to get back up again to the top of the system.
Correct.
So environmental water really aims to fill the gap so that the wetlands and floodplains, which are in that previous image, in this image, that they can still get some water and still provide some wetland habitat for wetland dependent plants and animals. Some of the processes, really important processes that water for the environment provides for is that it stimulates animals like native fish to feed and breed. So, for example, we were just talking about the weirs, but fish movement is really important for some species. They need to be able to move up and down the river, and they also need to be able to move onto floodplains, which provides a really nice habitat for them to spawn and look after their babies to grow nice and big before they move back into the river system. It also putting water into wetlands and onto the floodplain, and also even just onto the riverbanks, up the riverbanks, can trigger plants to seed and germinate. And if the water is there for long enough, which is something that we aim to do with environmental water, is to make sure that we're providing the right duration. It means that there's enough time for those plants to be able to grow, establish, flower, and set seed, and the seed goes back into the seed bank for the next time that it floods. Another thing that environmental water can do when we are able to connect rivers and the floodplain, essentially it moves carbon from the floodplains back into the river system, and carbon is a really important source of food, especially for fish, but for other aquatic animals as well. We can provide connectivity with environmental water. So when we talk about connectivity, that means that we're providing connections between waterways or between the floodplain and the river. And that means that fish and plants can move around and colonize new areas as they need to. Environmental water, when we flood a floodplain, it can also help to recharge the groundwater aquifers. and it also can flush out salt along riverbanks and floodplains. And because it stimulates plants to grow, it usually means that it can help to stabilize riverbanks as well, because those roots can grow nice and strong and hold the riverbanks together. So environmental water can be used in a few different ways. We can put it down a river, so we can put it down a river as a rise in the water levels, or we can use it to fill a wetland, and we can also use it to flood a floodplain.
So Jen, we had a question from Lily who wanted to know, do you put environmental water in the rivers every year?
Yes, we do. So over the spring and summer and autumn, there's usually a lot of agricultural uses for water. So often there's water in the rivers in those periods simply to meet irrigation demand. But over the winter in particular, that's the off irrigation season. And that's when water for the environment can be put down rivers to make sure that there's still some riverine habitat for fish and turtles and frogs and other aquatic biota. And then in spring, we can also deliver over the top of the irrigation flows to provide a spring fresh, which will stimulate fish to move and spawn.
So it's obviously going to be a little bit dependent on what sort of river or waterway it is, whether it does have that irrigation flow or not. What about if it's a really wet year? If there's lots of rain naturally, do you still need to put an environmental flow or water for the environment down the river?
That's a really good question. So in wet years, we keep a very keen eye on the forecast and can make plans around using what we call unregulated flows, which simply means that it's excess water in the system, and that can be used to provide those spring freshes that I mentioned. And it can even be used to provide that low flow over the winter if those flows are available. But generally in most years, we would probably be using environmental water at some point throughout the year to supplement either the natural flows that we might see or to supplement irrigation demand.
Great, thanks, Jen.
So I wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of the wetting and drying phases. So this image is a little diagram about what you can see in a wet phase. So this looks like a wetland in particular, but it's very similar for rivers as well. So when you flood a wetland, you are supporting the vegetation to grow, and in turn that vegetation, like the river red gums, for example, is really important for water birds to breed in. So you may have water birds like cormorants and egrets that will nest in those trees. They like to nest in trees that are over water. But you also will stimulate processes that mean that there's lots of food around for other types of water birds like ducks and swans as well. And they like to breed in rushes and sedge type of habitat. When you re-wet a dry wetland, it stimulates lots of activity at the base of the food chain. Lots of bugs, zooplankton and bugs, and then frogs, and then fish, and then water birds. So there's lots of food around for a whole variety of animals. And the other thing it can do is in that wet phase, if it's connected to the river, you can get that connectivity between the wetland and the river, which is really important for things like fish movement, to be able to move on and off the wetland or the floodplain. So the drying phase of a wetland is also a really important part of the wetland flooding cycle. So when wetlands start to draw down, you'll see things like the soils will start to crack, which is really important because it gets oxygen down into the soils. And it also means that seeds can fall into those cracks and they'll stay down there until the next flood comes, and they just become part of what we call the seed bank. There's a lot of plants also that grow on the drawdown of a wetland, of a drying phase, sorry, and those mudflat species are also really important food sources for a lot of water birds that will visit the wetland only when there's things like mudflats available.
So what sort of creatures would you see on mudflats at those particular times? Are you talking frogs and things like that?
Probably less so frogs, but more like herons and other types of wading birds, those big wader birds.
Yep.
They'll visit those mud flats because they like to stick their beaks in and into the mud and try and suck up as much little bugs that are still around as they can. The mudflats and the green vegetation also do provide food for other big grazing animals like kangaroos and emus. Yeah.
And we actually had a question around the drying phase from Gemma. Wanted to know what happens to the fish when a wetland dries out?
Another very good question. Depending on whether the wetland is connected to a river, as the wetland draws down, fish can sometimes be cued to move back into the river system. But if it's in a wetland that's not connected to the river, as the wetland dries, most of those fish will actually become important food sources mainly for water birds. Yeah, it's a very common occurrence in Australian river systems. Very natural, normal thing to happen in the drying phase. Yeah.
And the birds have got to eat something at that time, don't they?
Yes, that's right.
Great question, Gemma.
Yeah. So environmental water also has a really important role to play when it comes to improving water quality. Like you can see in the photo here, it stimulates a lot of aquatic and semi-aquatic plants to grow, and they actually act like filters. So they'll filter the water and they can start to pull nutrients out of the water and other pollutants. And hold them so that if water continues to flow through that system, it'll actually sort of get cleaned before it gets back into the river system.
And you can really sort of tell that by looking at that photo. It's quite a dense stand of reeds, isn't it? You can kind of imagine that acting like a filtration system as the water passes through.
Yeah, that's right. Definitely. Vegetation is a really important objective that we try and target with environmental water. There's lots of aquatic vegetation that you're only going to see when there's water there. So it's very special habitat actually, because you only see it usually for a couple of months of the year and not in every year. So what you're looking at on the screen there, the top two photos are a dry photo and compared to the wet photo. And in the wet photo, you can see lots of green, lush vegetation that's coming up. And that's all aquatic vegetation that needs a flood to make its appearance. And you can also see that the leaves on the trees are a lot greener. And that's a really important thing that we target with environmental water too. In the bottom photo, you can actually see, again, the trees. There's lots of new leaves coming out on those trees to the left. And on the right-hand side, you can see this is where environmental water reached in one of our watering events. The water basically stops and the trees start to look a bit more sad with less leaves and less canopy cover.
That's amazing to see it in one photo like that, isn't it? You can see the real difference between the wet part of the forest and the dry part of the forest. Incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty extraordinary and a very unique thing to see in Australian river systems. Very, very special.
So one of the questions, Jack asked a question that's related to that, I think. He wanted to know what would happen if we didn't provide water for the environment.
Another very good question. Well, as you can see in that photo down the bottom, on the right-hand side, those are the areas that don't get environmental water. We can't reach them with environmental water. And in the middle of a hot summer, it's very stark. The difference is very stark. So without water for the environment, the trees would be, and outside the environmental water footprint, they certainly are declining in condition. Some of them are starting to die, which is really sad to see. And without water for the environment, you wouldn't have that lovely aquatic vegetation that grows. And things like frogs and turtles need that vegetation, and also small-bodied fish. They also really need that vegetation as a refuge, as well as food. So you start to see a decline in the populations of a lot of wetland-dependent species, and water for the environment can help slow the decline, or even in some areas can actually help to improve those populations. So it has a very important role to play.
And I imagine a very important role to play in the whole ecosystem and ensuring a nice balance in the whole cycle, the whole food web and the whole ecosystem health too. So
that's right. If you go too long between floods, things like that aquatic vegetation won't come back. So it's really important to have healthy habitats all across the landscape, so that lots of plants and animals can move between those areas, and that you're supporting those local populations as well. So another really important role that water for the environment plays is that we can actually supplement natural flooding. If a natural flood has stimulated, say, a waterbird breeding event, and I mentioned those cormorants that like to nest in trees that are over water, which you can see in that photo on the right-hand side. And if a natural flood has stimulated a breeding event like that, we can actually deliver water for the environment as the flood drops away. We can maintain water levels underneath those nests, which is really important, because sometimes if that happens too rapidly, if the water levels drop too rapidly, it can actually cause waterbirds to abandon their nests before they've finished laying their eggs or getting their chicks to fledging stage. And water for the environment is also really important for stimulating breeding of other species as well, particularly frogs, like that tiny little frog in the photo, and that very cute little turtle as well. And also those little tiny baby Murray cod hatchlings that are much smaller than a 5-cent piece.
They are.
Yeah.
So you can top up a natural flood, essentially. So if there's a natural flood, but you're not getting that follow-up rain to keep the water level there for that breeding event to complete its cycle, you might bring in some water for the environment to top it up and keep it there for that little bit longer.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we do see now that natural floods don't last as long as they used to. So they may flood and then drop away quite quickly, and that's where we would step in with water for the environment to maintain those water levels.
And we had one question which may be a difficult one to answer easily, Jen, but we'll see how you go. Sam wanted to know, where do you get the water from to do this, to do these watering events, water for the environment?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think I mentioned earlier that the environment has its own entitlement, which is basically means that the environment has its own right to access water. these entitlements are relatively new. They've only really existed in the last 20 years or so. But it basically means that some government agencies they're called the environmental water holders, and they're charged with administering the environmental water. So they'll work with catchment management authorities, like where I work, to make decisions around where environmental water can go each year. And the proportion of environmental water that's available every year changes according to the climate and climatic conditions. So if there's been a really wet year, there's more environmental water available. And if it's a really dry time, there's less environmental water available.
So they get the water from the reservoirs, a specific amount of water for the environment from the reservoirs, and deliver it through the waterways in that way. Yeah?
Yeah, that's right. So basically we'll sit in the dams and weirs until it's ready to be used downstream.
Great.
So environmental water also has a really important role to play in assisting with fish movement. So I think I mentioned earlier that fish movement is also a really important part of the fish breeding cycle. So some of them need to move in order to spawn. And in this photo here, you can actually see two types of fishways. So on the left-hand side, there's a rock ramp fishway, which is, I guess made up of a lot of rocks, and fish can sort of wind their way through that. And the other type of fishway is one where in that photo on the right-hand side, you can see a sort of channel going around the weir, and they can actually swim up through that and go above the weir to below the weir and vice versa. But environmental water can actually be used to create what we call a queue for fish to move. So if we raise the river levels quite quickly, for some species, that's a cue to move, and they may move upstream to their spawning grounds in particular. So we really try and target that at the right time of year, which is usually around spring, when there's warmer water temperatures, and that's usually when fish will need to move to spawn.
So another term for fishway is a fish ladder as well. And looking at the rock ramp fishway there, that would have replaced a weir, would it? Is that where a weir would have once been, and they've put rocks in there now to sort of keep the water level still up a little bit, but allow the fish to move instead of hitting that wall again with their heads? They've actually got the ability to move upstream now through there. And there is still a weir in the other photo. You can still see the weir just on the bottom, just below the fishway.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So water for the environment, when you reflood a wetland or a floodplain after it's been dry for a while, it can stimulate a lot of activity at the base of the food chain. So a lot of zooplankton and a lot of water bugs as well, which end up being fish food. And in that photo there, you can see a couple of the different types of bugs that we can find, and also some of those small fish. And that photo there of the leaves in the water, and there's lots of bugs in that water that are all buzzing around, just waiting to be eaten by a big fish. Yeah.
Lots of fish food.
Lots and lots. Yeah. Water for the environment also has a role to play in reducing blackwater and algal blooms. So there's a few photos on here that I'll explain. And I'm not sure if you guys have learnt about blackwater through the River Detectives program, but basically what happens when there's a blackwater event is that there's lots of organic material, like the leaves and twigs and things that are on the base of a wetland or a floodplain, or even on riverbanks. and it all gets washed into the water, and those bugs and the zooplankton start getting really active while they're eating and breaking down those carbon sources. And as they do start to gobble up that good carbon source, they actually use a lot of oxygen. And sometimes if there's too many of them, they can use up too much oxygen, and it can mean that fish and other aquatic animals will start to struggle to breathe within the water. So usually a blackwater event happens after a really big flood when a lot of that carbon has been washed into the river system. And in that photo up the top left-hand side, you can actually see blackwater moving from the floodplain into the river. But it's also important to note that not all blackwater is bad. So because it's all got lots of carbon and organic material in it, it's actually really important fish food as well. So as long as it doesn't reach those low oxygen levels, it's actually a good thing for the river system. When there is a hypoxic blackwater event, which means low oxygen blackwater event, water for the environment can be delivered through waterways to try and freshen it up and bring more higher oxygen water into the system to try and support native fish and other aquatic animals. And the other thing, similar to blackwater, but very toxic, is blue-green algae. And that's a photo of the blue-green algae in the top right-hand corner. This is a really tricky one to deal with because usually when we have blue-green algae events, they can be quite widespread. And you also don't want to spread it too far down the system because you can spread the event. But water for the environment plays a really important role in stopping it from happening in the first place. So if we're continuing to deliver fresh water down the rivers over, especially in the warmer months, which is when blue-green algae is most active, yeah, we can help to stop these sort of events from happening in the first place.
I must say I've never seen such a pale blue-green algae before. It's interesting to see that it can come in all sorts of different colours, can't it?
Yeah, that's right. And that one's particularly gross. Yeah. So I've covered off on water birds and fish, and I talked a little bit about turtles and frogs, but water for the environment is also really important for a lot of other species as well. So on this screen, we've got the platypus and yabbies and turtles and different types of water birds, like that kingfisher needs a lot of native fish to eat. And having a healthy river system means that a whole host of plants and animals can survive in those spaces where there's a healthy vegetation, healthy water, and lots of food sources around for them to eat. And water for the environment is also very important for people. There's lots of tourism opportunities when wetlands and waterways are full. Lots of fishing opportunities, bird watching opportunities, kayaking opportunities. There's a lot of fun to be had out on the waterways. And importantly, wetlands and waterways are also very sacred places for our traditional owners. There's a lot of very important cultural places along waterways and wetlands. And for them, having those spaces in a healthy condition is also really important to have healthy people as well.
And I imagine that a lot of the traditional owners and First Nations people would have a very strong connection to wetlands and waterways too. So very important to have them in a really healthy state.
That's right. I think that's it.
And that's it. Wow, thank you, Jen. That was absolutely fantastic. I really enjoyed that, and I learnt some things myself too, just by going through this with you. So thanks very much. I really enjoyed learning about the wetting and drying process, and didn't know about the cracking of the soils and the importance there to allow the frogs and the little water bugs and things to get down into the damp mud through the cracks there. So certainly seen a lot of cracking soils like that in drying out wetlands, but never really thought about it before. And I didn't know that cormorants nested over the water either. So yeah, that's really fascinating stuff to learn, and yeah, really teaches us how important water for the environment is, particularly with our drying climate. And yeah, I think there's so many benefits and so many important reasons to have our water for the environment to help benefit our rivers and wetlands. So thanks so much, Jen. Thank you very much for your time today. Really appreciate it. And I hope that all of our River Detective students have learnt something too. And yeah, hope you enjoyed this session. So thanks for joining us, everybody. Thank you. Thanks, Jen. Bye.